The Thanksgiving dinner table had been set for 12, but somehow, all the conversations seemed to center on the empty chair between my sister Jessica and me. Mom had insisted on the traditional family interrogation about our careers, and Jessica was clearly enjoying her moment in the spotlight. "So tell everyone about your promotion, Jess," Mom prompted, beaming with the kind of pride that made my stomach tighten just slightly. Jessica straightened in her chair, smoothing her perfectly pressed blazer. At 28, she had cultivated the look of someone who took herself very seriously. Sharp suits, expensive accessories, and an expression that suggested she was always calculating profit margins. "Well," she began, clearly savoring the attention, "I just made senior associate at Meridian Financial. Youngest person in the company's history to reach that level. Starting salary is $140 base, plus bonuses." The appropriate sounds of family admiration filled the dining room. Uncle Robert raised his wine glass in a toast. Cousin Mike asked impressed questions about investment strategies. Dad nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose practical advice had been vindicated. Then Jessica's gaze settled on me with the particular smugness that only siblings can perfect. "Of course, some of us prioritized earning potential from the beginning," she said, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to make the barb seem almost affectionate. "Instead of wasting 4 years on—" She paused dramatically. "What was it again, Emma? Art history?" The pause that followed was exactly long enough for me to feel the weight of every family gathering where this conversation had played out in various forms. My degree choice had been a source of family tension since my sophomore year of college, when I'd switched from pre-law to pursue what Jessica consistently called a hobby disguised as education. "Museum studies, actually," I corrected mildly, taking a sip of wine to buy myself a moment, "with a focus on contemporary art curation." Jessica's laugh had the brittle quality of someone who thought she was being incredibly clever. "Right, museum studies, because that's definitely a growth industry. How's the job market for, what do you even call it, professional art looking?" The family chuckled politely, the way families do when they're not sure if they should laugh, but don't want to seem unsupportive of the obvious winner in the conversation. "It's called curation," I said, still keeping my voice level, "and it's going well." "Oh, I'm sure it's fulfilling," Jessica continued, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension that made it clear she considered fulfillment a luxury for people who couldn't handle real careers. "But at some point, Emma, you're going to need to think practically. You can't live on passion forever." Dad cleared his throat in the way that meant he was about to offer unwanted advice. "You know, sweetheart, it's not too late to consider law school. Or maybe an MBA. Something with better prospects." I had heard variations of this conversation for 6 years, ever since I'd announced my intention to pursue graduate work in museum studies, instead of following Jessica into business school. The family narrative had crystallized around Jessica as the practical success story, and me as the dreamy idealist, who would eventually need to be rescued from my impractical choices. "I appreciate the concern," I said, "but I'm actually doing fine." "Define fine," Jessica challenged, "because I'm pretty sure fine doesn't pay off student loans or build retirement savings." The assumptions underlying her question were so comprehensive that I hardly knew where to begin correcting them. Jessica had constructed an entire narrative about my life based on stereotypes about liberal arts careers, and she had never bothered to ask questions that might complicate that narrative. "Well," I said carefully, "I finished my PhD last year." "A PhD in museum studies?" Jessica's eyebrows rose in what might have been genuine surprise. "Emma, you're just digging yourself deeper into debt for degrees that won't help you in the real world." "Actually, the PhD was fully funded, full scholarship plus stipend." Jessica waved dismissively. "Stipends aren't real salaries. What are you making now, 30,000? 35? The number she'd thrown out was so far from reality that I almost laughed. Instead, I took another sip of wine and considered how much of this conversation I actually wanted to have at Thanksgiving dinner. "Something like that," I said, which was technically true if you ignored the fact that my current salary was approximately 4 times her estimate. Jessica's expression softened into what she probably thought was sisterly compassion. "Look, Em, I'm not trying to be mean. I just want you to be realistic about your future. The art world is nice as a hobby, but you need to think about stability." "What exactly do you think I do for work?" I asked, genuinely curious about the assumptions she'd been making. I assume you're working at some small museum somewhere, maybe giving tours, writing brochures, entry-level stuff while you figure out what you actually want to do. The gap between Jessica's assumptions and my actual career was so vast that I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for her. She had been constructing her sense of superiority based on a completely fictional version of my life. That's not quite accurate, I said. Then what do you do? I hesitated, not because I was ashamed of my work, but because explaining it accurately would completely destroy the family dynamic that everyone seemed comfortable with. Jessica needed to be the successful one, and I had apparently been cast as the cautionary tale about following your dreams. I'm the director of contemporary art at the Metropolitan Museum, I said quietly. The silence that followed was the kind that makes you suddenly aware of background noises you hadn't noticed before. The clink of silverware, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of football from the neighbor's house. The Metropolitan Museum? Mom asked, her voice carrying a note of confusion. In New York? Yes. The Metropolitan Museum of Art? Dad's question came out as more of a statement, as if he was trying to process information that didn't fit with his understanding of the world. Yes. Jessica's face had gone through several rapid changes of expression before settling on something that looked like disbelief mixed with irritation. That's not possible. You're 31 years old. People don't become directors at major museums in their 30s. Associate director, I corrected, but yes, it's unusual. How? The single word came out sharper than Jessica had probably intended. I set down my wine glass and tried to figure out how to explain 6 years of career development that my family had apparently been completely unaware of. After I finished my master's degree, I was accepted into the Whitney's Curatorial Fellowship program. That led to a junior curator position there, which led to several successful exhibitions that got attention from other institutions. When the Met was looking for someone to lead their Emerging Contemporary Artists Initiative, my dissertation advisor recommended me. What was your dissertation on? Uncle Robert asked, suddenly sounding much more interested in my career than he had 5 minutes earlier. The intersection of digital media and traditional art forms in contemporary gallery spaces. Specifically, how museums can adapt their curatorial practices to engage with artists who work primarily in virtual or interactive mediums. Jessica was staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. You never mentioned any of this. The Whitney Fellowship, the exhibitions, any of it. You never asked. The truth was more complicated than that, of course. I had tried to share my professional successes with my family over the years, but those conversations had consistently been overshadowed by Jessica's more easily quantifiable achievements. Business school graduation, first job, promotion, salary increase. These were milestones that everyone understood and could celebrate. Curatorial fellowships, exhibition reviews, and academic publications didn't translate as easily to family dinner conversation. But how much do you make? Jessica asked, as if salary was the only metric that could resolve her confusion about my actual career trajectory. Enough. That's not an answer. I looked around the table at my family, all of whom were now paying attention in a way they hadn't been when they thought I was the underachiever at the table. My base salary is $215,000, I said, plus benefits, travel allowance, and discretionary funds for acquisitions and special projects. The silence that followed was even more complete than the previous one. That's impossible, Jessica said flatly. Museum work doesn't pay that much. Major museum work does. Especially when you're responsible for acquisitions, donor relations, and managing multi-million-dollar exhibition budgets. Dad was looking at me as if he was seeing me for the first time. Emma, why didn't you ever tell us about your success? I tried. But every conversation about my career got redirected to questions about when I was going to get serious about my future, or consider more practical options. Jessica had been quiet for several minutes, clearly trying to recalibrate her understanding of our relative positions in the family hierarchy. So when you said you were doing fine, she said slowly, you meant you were doing better than fine. I meant I was doing well enough that I didn't need career advice. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. Honey, I'm so proud of you. I had no idea you had achieved so much. I know, I said, and there was no resentment in it, just acknowledgement of how our family communication had worked for the past several years. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking questions about my work that they had never thought to ask before. I told them about the exhibitions I had curated, the artists I worked with, the board meetings where I presented acquisition strategies to donors whose names appeared on museum wings. Jessica participated in the conversation, but I could see her processing the implications of what she was learning. For 6 years, she had built her identity as the family success story partly in contrast to what she perceived as my impractical choices. Having that contrast suddenly disappear required some significant mental adjustment. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I was in my office at the Met, reviewing proposals for a spring exhibition on digital art installations, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Dr. Rodriguez, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your sister?" I looked up from the proposals, surprised. Jessica had never visited my office before, partly because she lived in Philadelphia, and partly because she had never shown any interest in seeing where I worked. "Sent her in." Jessica appeared in the doorway a moment later, looking around my office with an expression I couldn't quite read. The space was admittedly impressive. Large windows overlooking Central Park, walls lined with art books and exhibition catalogs, a desk that had probably cost more than most people's cars. "Nice office," she said, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk. "Thanks. What brings you to New York?" "I had a client meeting in Manhattan this morning." She paused, seeming uncertain about how to continue. "Actually, that's kind of why I wanted to see you." I waited for her to explain. "The client meeting was at Harrington Industries. Do you know them?" I nodded. Harrington was a major corporate art collector and museum sponsor. We had worked with them on several acquisitions over the past few years. "My company is trying to land their investment portfolio management contract. It's a huge account, probably the biggest I've ever worked on." "That's exciting." Jessica fidgeted with her purse strap, still seeming uncertain about whatever she had come to say. "The thing is, I'm meeting with their head of strategic partnerships this afternoon. And when I was researching the company, I noticed they do a lot of work with museums and cultural institutions." "They do. They're very committed to supporting contemporary art." "Right. So I was wondering," she trailed off, then seemed to gather her courage. "Would it be appropriate for me to mention that my sister works at the Met? I mean, would that be helpful for the relationship, or would it seem like name-dropping?" I studied my sister's face, trying to understand what was really being asked. 6 months ago, she had been mocking my career choices at Thanksgiving dinner. Now she was asking whether my professional reputation might be useful for her business development. "It depends on who you're meeting with," I said carefully. "Someone named David Chen. He's their head of strategic partnerships and cultural investments." I felt a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "David Chen?" "Yes, do you know him?" "Jessica, David Chen used to be my intern." The expression on Jessica's face was worth the entire awkward Thanksgiving conversation. She stared at me as if I had just revealed that I was secretly related to someone famous. "Your intern?" 3 years ago, when he was finishing his MBA at Columbia, he did a semester internship with our corporate partnerships department. I was his supervisor. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak again. He's the head of strategic partnerships at a billion-dollar company. David is very talented. I wrote one of his recommendation letters when he was applying for the position at Harrington. You wrote his recommendation letter. I did. He was an excellent intern, very bright, great instincts for understanding how corporate partnerships can benefit both parties. Jessica sat back in her chair, clearly processing the implications of what she had just learned. "So when I go into this meeting this afternoon, you'll be meeting with someone who knows me professionally and respects my judgment. And if I mention that you're my sister, David will probably be very interested in that connection, yes." We sat in silence for a moment while Jessica absorbed this information. "Emma," she said finally, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For everything I said at Thanksgiving. For all the times I've dismissed your career or suggested you needed to get serious about your future. For assuming that success could only look one way." I appreciated the apology, but I also recognized that it was motivated partly by her realization that my professional connections might be useful to her. You don't need to apologize for not understanding my career, I said, but it might be worth examining why you assumed your path was the only valid one. Jessica nodded, looking genuinely chastened. I think I was so focused on proving that my choices were right that I couldn't see that your choices might be right too. Different people find success in different ways. Obviously, she gestured around my office. This is incredible, Em. I had no idea. We talked for another 20 minutes about my work, her work, and the ways that our career paths had developed differently than either of us had expected. When she left for her meeting with David, Jessica seemed both excited about the potential business opportunity and sobered by how much she had misunderstood about my professional life. That evening, I received a text from Jessica. Got the account? David says to tell you hello and that he still uses the project management framework you taught him. Thank you for not throwing me under the bus when you had every right to. I smiled as I typed my response. Congratulations, I never doubted you'd get it. 6 months later, I was attending the opening night of our major spring exhibition when I spotted Jessica across the gallery, talking animatedly with David Chen and several other people I recognized as Harrington Industries executives. She caught my eye and waved, then made her way over to where I was standing with a group of artists and donors. Emma, I want you to meet some people, she said, gesturing to the Harrington group. This is my sister, Dr. Emma Rodriguez, the Director of Contemporary Art here at the Met. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and completely different from the condescending tone she had used to discuss my career at Thanksgiving dinner. David Chen smiled and shook my hand. Dr. Rodriguez, it's great to see you again. I was just telling Jessica about how much I learned from working with you during my internship. David was an exceptional intern, I replied. Though I think he's surpassed anything I could have taught him. I doubt that, he said. The strategic thinking framework you developed for corporate cultural partnerships is still something we reference regularly. As the conversation continued, I noticed Jessica watching the interaction with a kind of amazed attention. She was seeing, perhaps for the first time, how I was regarded by the professionals in my field. Later that evening, as the opening reception was winding down, Jessica found me again. I keep thinking about Thanksgiving, she said. About how completely wrong I was about your life. You weren't wrong about everything, you were right that I followed a non-traditional path. But I was wrong about what that path led to. We stood together in the gallery, surrounded by the contemporary art installations that represented months of planning, negotiation, and collaboration between artists, curators, and institutional partners. You know what's funny? Jessica continued. I spent so much time trying to convince you that my way was the right way that I never stopped to consider whether your way might be better. There's no better or worse. There are just different definitions of success. But you found a way to have both. You're doing work you're passionate about, and you're incredibly successful by any conventional measure. I considered her observation. I think the key was never letting other people's definitions of success override my own understanding of what I wanted to accomplish. Even when those other people were your family? Especially then. Jessica laughed, but it was a different kind of laugh than the one she had used to dismiss my career choices at Thanksgiving. This one carried self-awareness, and perhaps a little embarrassment. I'm sorry I spent so many years thinking I knew better than you did about your own life. You were looking out for me in the way you knew how. You genuinely thought I was making mistakes. I was so focused on traditional markers of success that I couldn't see success when it took a different form. As we left the museum together that night, Jessica asked me about my upcoming projects, my thoughts on trends in contemporary art, and the challenges of managing institutional relationships with living artists. They were the kinds of questions she had never thought to ask before, when she assumed my work was just an elaborate hobby. You know, she said as we parted ways outside the museum, I'm actually really proud to be your sister. I'm proud to be yours too. Even after all the grief I gave you about your career? Especially after that. It takes character to admit when you've been wrong about something important. 3 years later, I was giving a keynote address at a conference on arts administration when I spotted Jessica in the audience. She had driven down from Philadelphia to hear me speak, something that would have been unimaginable during our earlier family dynamics. After my presentation, she approached the lectern with a wide smile. That was incredible, she said. I understood maybe half of what you were talking about, but I could tell everyone else was hanging on every word. The field has gotten more complex as digital media has become more central to contemporary art practice. See, even that sentence is completely over my head. But I love that you're the expert that other experts come to learn from. We had dinner together that evening, and Jessica told me about her own career developments. She had been promoted to senior vice president at her firm and was being considered for partnership. More importantly, she had developed expertise in managing investment portfolios for arts organizations and cultural institutions. I started specializing in that area partly because of what I learned about your work, she admitted. I realized there was a whole sector of nonprofit and cultural financing that I had never understood. How's it working out? Really well. It turns out that understanding how museums and galleries operate gives me insights that most financial advisors don't have. I've built a pretty successful niche practice. As we talked, I realized that Jessica's initial mockery of my career had evolved into something much more productive. Her business success had taught her to recognize value in areas she hadn't previously understood, and my career had provided her with insights that enhanced her own professional development. I keep thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner, she said as we were finishing dessert, about how sure I was that I understood the world better than you did. You understood your world better than I did, but you didn't understand my world at all. And I didn't realize there were different worlds to understand. Looking back, I could see that Jessica's mockery had come from a place of genuine concern, mixed with a very narrow definition of professional success. She had sincerely believed that I was making choices that would limit my opportunities and financial security. The fact that my choices had led to both personal fulfillment and financial success had required her to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about how careers develop. The thing I've learned, Jessica continued, is that success isn't just about following a proven formula. Sometimes it's about being smart enough to see opportunities that other people miss. Or being persistent enough to create opportunities that didn't exist before. Like becoming a museum director before anyone thought you were old enough for that kind of responsibility. Or like becoming the go-to financial advisor for cultural institutions in the Mid-Atlantic region. Jessica laughed. Touché. As we parted ways that evening, I reflected on how dramatically our relationship had evolved since that first Thanksgiving confrontation. Jessica had gone from mocking my degree to being genuinely proud of my career, and I had gone from feeling defensive about my choices to feeling confident that I had found my own path to success. The moment when Jessica learned that her boss was my former intern had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a more honest and respectful relationship between two sisters who had found different ways to build successful careers. Most importantly, Jessica had learned that her initial assumptions about my life were based more on stereotypes than reality, and I had learned that her mockery came from a place of caring, even if it was expressed in a hurtful way. Years later, when people ask me about dealing with family members who don't understand or support your career choices, I tell them about Jessica. I explain that sometimes the people who mock your decisions are operating from their own fears and limitations, and that patience and success are often more persuasive than arguments. The sister who once mocked my degree now regularly refers clients to me when they need expertise in cultural institution management. The woman who thought I was wasting my education now boasts to her colleagues about her sister, who runs major exhibitions at one of the world's most prestigious museums. And the intern who once brought me coffee and helped with filing is now someone Jessica considers one of her most important professional relationships. It's funny how life comes full circle, and how the career choices that seem impractical to some people can turn out to create opportunities that nobody anticipated. Jessica learned that lesson the hard way, but she learned it thoroughly. These days, she never questions my career decisions. In fact, she usually asks for my advice before making major professional moves of her own. The sister who mocked my degree eventually discovered that her boss was my former intern. But more importantly, she discovered that success comes in many different forms, and that underestimating someone based on their educational choices is usually a mistake. Now when we have family dinners, Jessica introduces me as my sister, the museum director, with the same pride she once reserved for her own achievements. And when young family members talk about pursuing careers in the arts or humanities, Jessica is the first one to encourage them to follow their passions. She learned that sometimes the impractical choice turns out to be the most practical one of all. 2 years after that dinner conversation, I was sitting in the boardroom of the Metropolitan Museum, presenting our annual acquisition strategy to the Board of Trustees. The presentation covered emerging artists we wanted to support, established pieces we hoped to acquire, and the strategic partnerships that would make these acquisitions possible. "Dr. Rodriguez," said Margaret Whitman, the board chair and heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, "your proposal for the digital art wing is ambitious. The budget you're requesting is substantial." "It is," I agreed, "but the investment will position the Met as the leading institution for contemporary digital and interactive art. We're not just acquiring pieces, we're building the infrastructure for a completely new kind of museum experience." Board member James Harrison leaned forward. "Can you walk us through the partnership structure you've outlined? I want to understand how the corporate sponsorships will work." I clicked to the next slide, which showed a complex web of relationships between tech companies, traditional art collectors, and emerging digital artists. The cornerstone partnership is with Harrington Industries. They're providing both financial support and technical expertise for the interactive installations. Additionally, we're working with 3 smaller firms that specialize in digital art curation and preservation. "And you're confident in these partnerships?" asked Dr. Sarah Chen, the board's newest member and a prominent collector of contemporary art. "Absolutely. I've worked with several of these partners before, and our institutional relationships are strong." What I didn't mention in the boardroom was that one of those smaller firms was Jessica's new company. 6 months earlier, she had left her position at Meridian Financial to start her own consultancy focused on financial services for cultural institutions. Her first major client had been a mid-sized museum in Philadelphia that needed help restructuring their endowment management. Her success with that project had led to referrals, and now she was building a reputation as someone who understood both the financial and cultural sides of arts administration. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica, who had once mocked my impractical career choice, was now building her own career around serving the exact industry she had dismissed. After the board meeting, I returned to my office to find a message from Jessica asking if I had time for a phone call. When I called her back, she sounded excited in a way I hadn't heard since she'd gotten her first big promotion at Meridian. I have news, big news." "Tell me." "The Whitney wants to hire my firm to restructure their entire financial operations. It's a 2-year contract, and if it goes well, it could establish us as the go-to firm for major museum financial management." I felt a surge of pride for my sister that caught me off guard. "Jessica, that's incredible. How did you land that contract?" "Honestly, your reputation helped open the door. The Whitney's finance committee was impressed that I was Dr. Emma Rodriguez's sister. But I got the contract on my own merits. I never doubted that for a second. The thing is," Jessica continued, "I'm going to need to hire more people. The scope of work is bigger than anything I've handled before. And I was wondering, do you know anyone in arts administration who might be interested in joining a financial consulting firm?" I thought for a moment. "Actually, I might. Let me make some calls." Over the following weeks, I connected Jessica with 3 people from my professional network who were looking for new opportunities. One was a former Met employee who had experience in donor relations and financial planning. Another was a recent graduate from the NYU Arts Administration program who had been struggling to find a position that utilized both her business and cultural education. The third was a consultant who had been working independently and was interested in joining a larger firm. Jessica hired all 3, and within 6 months, her company had established itself as a serious player in the cultural institution financial services market. "You know what's funny?" she said during one of our regular phone calls. "I spent years thinking that the art world was financially naive and poorly managed. It turns out that it's actually incredibly sophisticated, just in ways I didn't understand." "How so?" "Museums have to balance mission-driven goals with financial sustainability. They have to manage relationships with donors who have very specific interests. They have to plan for acquisitions that might appreciate in value or might become culturally irrelevant. It's like managing an investment portfolio, where the assets have emotional and cultural value in addition to financial value." I smiled, recognizing the moment when someone discovers that an industry they had dismissed is actually much more complex than they had assumed. "And the people running these institutions," Jessica continued, They're not impractical dreamers. They're highly sophisticated managers who are balancing multiple constituencies and competing priorities. It sounds like you've gained some appreciation for museum work. I've gained appreciation for how wrong I was about museum work. That autumn, I was invited to speak at a conference on museum leadership in Chicago. The theme was Innovation in Cultural Institution Management, and my presentation focused on how museums could adapt their organizational structures to better serve contemporary artists and audiences. After my presentation, I was approached by a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Williams, the director of a mid-sized museum in Detroit. Dr. Rodriguez, I wanted to thank you for that presentation. The organizational models you described are exactly what we need to implement, but we're struggling with the financial restructuring required to make those changes. What kind of challenges are you facing? We want to expand our contemporary art programming, but our current endowment structure makes it difficult to allocate funds for acquisitions that don't have established market values. We need someone who understands both museum operations and financial planning. Have you considered working with a consultant who specializes in cultural institution finance? We've looked at several firms, but most of them treat museums like any other nonprofit. They don't understand the unique challenges of art acquisition and exhibition planning. I thought about Jessica's company and her growing expertise in exactly these kinds of problems. I might have a recommendation, I said, pulling out my business card and writing Jessica's contact information on the back. Rodriguez Financial Consulting specializes in cultural institutions. The owner understands both the business and cultural sides of museum operations. Dr. Williams looked at the card and smiled. Rodriguez? Are you related? She's my sister. The same sister who founded RFC? I nodded, and Dr. Williams's expression shifted to one of impressed recognition. Dr. Rodriguez, your sister's reputation in museum finance circles has grown incredibly quickly. Everyone I know who has worked with her says she's revolutionized how they think about financial planning. This was news to me. I had known that Jessica's business was successful, but I hadn't realized that she was developing a reputation within the museum world. I'll definitely reach out to her, Dr. Williams continued, and thank you for the recommendation. It means a lot coming from someone of your stature in the field. That evening, I called Jessica to tell her about the conversation with Dr. Williams. She seemed to know quite a bit about your work, I said. I got the impression that you're becoming well known in museum circles. Jessica laughed. It's funny how that happened. I started this company thinking I would apply standard financial consulting practices to cultural institutions. But the more I learned about how museums actually operate, the more I realized that they needed completely different approaches. Different how? Traditional financial planning assumes that you're trying to maximize return on investment. But museums are trying to maximize cultural impact while maintaining financial sustainability. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. She explained how she had developed new financial models that took into account the cultural value of acquisitions, the long-term impact of educational programming, and the complex relationships between donors, artists, and institutional mission. The work is actually much more interesting than anything I did in traditional finance, she said. Every institution has a different mission, different constraints, different opportunities. It's like solving puzzles that change every time. And you're making a good living? Better than I was at Meridian, actually. It turns out that specialized expertise in an underserved market is incredibly valuable. 6 months later, I was surprised to receive an invitation to speak at a conference on financial innovation in cultural institutions. The invitation had come from the American Alliance of Museums, and when I looked at the speaker list, I saw that Jessica was also presenting. When I called her to ask about it, she sounded almost embarrassed. They asked me to speak about alternative funding models for contemporary art acquisitions, she said. Apparently, the case studies from my work with various museums have gotten attention in the field. That's fantastic. What's your presentation about? I developed a financing model that allows museums to acquire contemporary art through partnerships with living artists. Instead of purchasing pieces outright, museums can enter into long-term agreements where artists retain partial ownership, but the institution gets exhibition and educational use rights. The model she described was genuinely innovative, a way for museums to expand their contemporary art holdings without the massive upfront costs that often made such acquisitions impossible. Jessica, that's brilliant. You've essentially created a new financial instrument for cultural institutions. It's just applying private equity principles to art acquisition, but apparently no one else has done it systematically. At the conference, I watched Jessica present her financial models to an audience of museum directors, curators, and arts administrators. Her presentation was polished, sophisticated, and clearly the result of deep thinking about the specific challenges facing cultural institutions. During the question and answer session, Dr. Margaret Foster, the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, raised her hand. Ms. Rodriguez, your model is intriguing, but it seems like it would require a level of legal and financial sophistication that many smaller institutions don't possess. How do you address that barrier? Jessica's response demonstrated just how thoroughly she had thought through the practical implications of her approach. That's exactly why we provide full-service implementation support. We draft the agreements, manage the legal reviews, and provide ongoing administration of the partnerships. The museums get the benefits of the model without needing to develop internal expertise in these new financial structures. After her presentation, I watched Jessica field questions from dozens of museum professionals who were interested in learning more about her services. The contrast with our Thanksgiving dinner conversation from years earlier was striking. The woman who had once dismissed museum work as impractical was now considered an innovator in the field. That evening, we had dinner together in downtown Chicago, and Jessica reflected on how dramatically her career had evolved. You know what I've realized, she said. I was right that financial thinking is important for long-term sustainability, but I was wrong about what financial thinking looks like in the cultural sector. How so? I thought financial sophistication meant maximizing profits and minimizing costs. But in the museum world, financial sophistication means finding creative ways to support your mission while maintaining organizational health. She described some of the innovative funding mechanisms she had developed, partnerships between museums and technology companies that provided both financial support and technical expertise, collaborative acquisition models that allowed multiple institutions to share ownership of expensive pieces, and endowment structures that generated income specifically for supporting living artists. The work is more intellectually challenging than anything I did in traditional finance, she said, and more meaningful too. How's the business side working out? Better than I ever expected. We have more work than we can handle, and I'm thinking about expanding into other cities. That's incredible. Jessica paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you credit for showing me that there were entire professional worlds I didn't know existed. You built your success on your own talents and hard work. But I built it in a field that I never would have discovered if I hadn't been forced to reckon with how wrong I was about your career. Over the following year, Jessica's business continued to grow. She opened offices in Los Angeles and Philadelphia, hired additional consultants, and began working with some of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the country. More importantly, her work was beginning to influence how the entire museum field thought about financial planning and sustainability. I was invited to serve on the advisory board of her company, partly because of my expertise in museum operations and partly because my professional reputation helped establish credibility with potential clients. It's funny, Jessica said during one of our advisory board meetings. I spent so many years thinking that I was the practical one and you were the dreamer. It turns out that you were being practical in ways I didn't understand. We were both being practical, we just had different definitions of what practical meant. But your definition turned out to be more accurate. The company's success had allowed Jessica to hire several people from my professional network, and I began to see how her financial expertise combined with their cultural knowledge was creating solutions that neither group could have developed alone. David Chen, my former intern and now Jessica's most important business partner through his role at Harrington Industries, had become a regular presence at advisory board meetings. Dr. Rodriguez, he said during one meeting, I wanted to thank you again for the recommendation that led to our partnership with Jessica's firm. The financial models she's developed have allowed us to support cultural institutions in ways that are both more effective and more strategic than our previous approach. How so? Instead of just writing checks to support exhibitions, we're now partners in acquisition strategies and long-term planning. It's allowed us to have much more impact with our cultural giving." Jessica smiled. "And it's provided more sustainable funding for the institutions. Everyone wins." Watching David and Jessica collaborate on complex financial structures for cultural institutions, I reflected on how far we had all come from that first Thanksgiving dinner conversation. David had evolved from intern to industry leader. Jessica had transformed from someone who mocked museum work to someone who was pioneering new approaches to museum finance. And I had gone from feeling defensive about my career choices to feeling confident that I had found meaningful work that also provided financial security. 3 years later, I was attending the opening night of a major exhibition on digital art at the Whitney Museum when I overheard a conversation that made me smile. "Did you see that the Rodriguez financial model is being used by museums in Europe now?" one curator was saying to another. "The alternative acquisition structure? Yes, it's brilliant. I heard that Jessica Rodriguez is being invited to speak at conferences internationally. She's revolutionized how we think about art acquisition financing." I found Jessica near the bar, engaged in animated conversation with several museum directors about a new collaborative funding initiative she was developing. "Emma," she called when she saw me approaching, "I was just telling everyone about the international expansion. We're opening a London office next year." "That's fantastic." "And," she continued with obvious excitement, "the Tate Modern wants to pilot our collaborative acquisition model for their contemporary art expansion." As the evening progressed, I watched Jessica move through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had found her professional calling. The woman who had once dismissed my career was now one of the most respected financial innovators in the cultural sector. Later that evening, as we shared a taxi back to our hotels, Jessica reflected on the trajectory that had brought her to this point. "I keep thinking about that Thanksgiving dinner," she said, "about how certain I was that I understood how the world worked." "You understood how your world worked. But I didn't realize there were other worlds. And I definitely didn't realize that some of those other worlds might be more interesting than the one I was in. Do you ever regret leaving traditional finance?" Jessica considered the question seriously. "Never. The work I'm doing now is more intellectually challenging, more personally meaningful, and more financially rewarding than anything I was doing before." "Even though it started from admitting you were wrong about my career?" "Especially because it started that way. Being wrong about something important was the best thing that ever happened to my professional development." As our taxi pulled up to Jessica's hotel, she gathered her purse and prepared to get out. "You know what the funniest part is?" she said. "I thought I was going to teach you about practical career choices. Instead, you taught me that the most practical choice is often the one that looks least practical from the outside." 5 years later, I was sitting in my office at the Met when my assistant buzzed to let me know that someone from the Harvard Business School was on the phone. "Dr. Rodriguez," the voice said when I picked up. "This is Professor Michael Harrison from the Harvard Business School. I'm calling because we're developing a new case study on innovative financial models in the nonprofit sector, and we'd like to feature the work your sister has done in cultural institution finance. I think you should speak with Jessica directly about that. Actually, we'd like to interview both of you." The case study is focusing on how professional collaborations between siblings can create innovative solutions that neither could have developed alone. I smiled, thinking about how far we had come from our early professional rivalry. "The story we want to tell," Professor Harrison continued, "is about how apparent disagreements about career choices can lead to productive partnerships when both parties are open to learning from each other." That's an interesting angle. "From our research, it appears that your sister's success in museum finance was directly enabled by her access to your expertise in museum operations. And your innovations in contemporary art curation have been supported by her financial models. It's a case study in how different types of expertise can be complementary rather than competitive." The Harvard case study was published the following year, and it attracted attention from business schools around the country. Jessica and I were invited to speak at several conferences about sibling professional relationships and interdisciplinary collaboration. "The thing that surprises people," Jessica said during one presentation, "is that our professional partnership grew out of what initially looked like professional conflict." "We had different ideas about what success should look like," I added. But it turned out that we were both right. We just needed to understand that there were multiple valid definitions of success. During the question and answer session, a student asked how we had moved from mocking each other's career choices to successful collaboration. "I think the key was being willing to admit when we were wrong," Jessica replied. I had to acknowledge that my understanding of the art world was based on stereotypes rather than knowledge. And I had to acknowledge that financial thinking was more important to cultural institutions than I had realized, I added. Neither of us had to give up our areas of expertise. We just had to learn to value each other's expertise. After the presentation, a young woman approached us with a question that reminded me of our earlier family dynamics. "I'm interested in arts administration," she said, "but my family keeps telling me it's not practical. They want me to go into business or law instead." Jessica and I exchanged a look, both recognizing the familiar tension between following your interests and meeting family expectations. "What kind of arts administration work interests you?" I asked. "Museum education. I want to develop programs that make art accessible to communities that traditionally haven't had access to cultural institutions." Jessica leaned forward with obvious interest. That's exactly the kind of programming that museums are struggling to fund sustainably. Have you thought about how you might structure those programs to be financially viable? The conversation that followed demonstrated how Jessica and I had learned to approach problems from both cultural and financial perspectives simultaneously. We suggested resources for the student, introduced her to people in our networks, and encouraged her to think about her interests as commercially viable rather than impractical. "The most important thing," Jessica said as we were wrapping up the conversation, "is not to let other people's limited understanding of your field prevent you from pursuing work that matters to you." "Even when those people are your family?" the student asked. "Especially when those people are your family," I replied. "Sometimes the people who love you most have the hardest time seeing past their own assumptions about what your life should look like." That evening, Jessica and I had dinner at a restaurant near the campus, and we reflected on how our relationship had evolved over the years. "I've been thinking about that student's question," Jessica said, "about family expectations and career choices. What about it? I realize now that when I was giving you grief about your career, I wasn't really worried about your financial security. I was worried that your choices reflected poorly on my choices." "How so?" "If you could be successful following your passion, what did that say about my decision to prioritize financial security over personal interest?" It was an insight that had taken Jessica years to develop, and I appreciated her willingness to be vulnerable about the psychological dynamics that had shaped our earlier conflicts. "I think we both made the right choices for who we were at the time," I said. "And we've both continued to evolve in ways that incorporated the best of both approaches. You found a way to be financially successful doing work you love. I found a way to do work I love that happens to be financially successful. And we learned that success doesn't have to be a zero-sum competition between siblings." As we walked back to our hotel after dinner, Jessica reflected on the trajectory that had brought us to this point. "You know what I'm most proud of?" she said. "What?" "Not just that we both became successful in our respective fields, but that we figured out how to support each other's success instead of competing with it. I'm proud of that too. And I'm proud that we can now tell our story to other families who are struggling with similar dynamics." The following year, Jessica was invited to give the keynote address at the annual conference of the Association of Museum Financial Officers. Her presentation, titled "When Your Sister Knows More About Your Industry Than You Do," was both personally revealing and professionally insightful. 7 years ago, she told the audience, "I thought my sister was wasting her education and limiting her career prospects by pursuing museum work. Today, she's considered one of the leading experts in contemporary art curation, and I run a company that exists primarily to serve the museum field." She went on to describe how her initial dismissal of the cultural sector had prevented her from recognizing the sophisticated financial challenges that museums face, and how learning to take those challenges seriously had opened up entirely new professional opportunities. "The lesson," she concluded, "is that industries you don't understand are often more complex and sophisticated than they appear from the outside. And the people you think are making impractical choices may actually be seeing opportunities that you're missing." After her presentation, Jessica was approached by dozens of museum professionals who wanted to share their own stories about family members who didn't understand their career choices. It's remarkable how universal this experience is, she told me later. Almost everyone in the cultural sector has dealt with family members who think they're being impractical. What do you tell them? That sometimes the best response to skepticism is success, and that sometimes the people who are most skeptical eventually become your strongest advocates. That advice proved prophetic in our own family. Dad, who had spent years suggesting that I consider law school or an MBA, now introduced me to his friends as my daughter, the museum director. Mom regularly shared articles about my exhibitions with her book club. Even Uncle Robert, who had once suggested that I consider something more stable, now asked for my advice when he was planning cultural activities for his retirement. Jessica's transformation from skeptic to advocate had been even more dramatic. She had gone from mocking my career to building her own career around serving the industry she had once dismissed. More importantly, she had become one of the most effective advocates for the cultural sector's economic importance and sophistication. I love that our story has a happy ending, she said during one of our regular phone conversations. But I also love that it's not just about individual success. We've both found ways to make the fields we work in stronger and more sustainable. How so? Your work in contemporary art curation has helped establish new models for how museums can engage with living artists. My work in cultural finance has created new funding mechanisms that allow institutions to be more ambitious in their programming. And we've both helped change perceptions about the viability of careers in the cultural sector. Exactly. We're proof that you can follow your interests and still be financially successful. As we concluded that conversation, I reflected on how completely our relationship had transformed since that first Thanksgiving dinner confrontation. Jessica had gone from being my harshest critic to being one of my most valuable professional collaborators. I had gone from feeling defensive about my choices to feeling confident that I had found a path that aligned my personal interests with professional success. Most importantly, we had both learned that there are many different ways to define and achieve success, and that the most fulfilling careers often emerge from the intersection of personal passion and professional opportunity. The sister who mocked my degree eventually discovered that her boss was my former intern, but more significantly, she discovered that the career she had dismissed as impractical was actually the foundation for her own professional transformation and success. Years later, when young people ask us about dealing with family skepticism about non-traditional career choices, we tell them our story. We explain that sometimes the people who doubt you most become your strongest supporters once they understand what you're actually accomplishing. We also tell them that success has many different forms, and that the most sustainable success often comes from finding work that aligns your personal values with your professional capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, we tell them that families can learn and grow together, and that conflicts about career choices can eventually become the foundation for stronger relationships and mutual respect. The woman who once thought museum work was impractical now runs one of the most innovative cultural finance companies in the country. The woman who once felt defensive about her career choices now serves on the boards of multiple cultural institutions and speaks internationally about contemporary art curation. And the intern who once brought us coffee now manages strategic partnerships worth millions of dollars and serves as a bridge between our respective areas of expertise. It's a reminder that careers develop in unexpected ways, that success comes in many forms, and that the people who seem to understand your field least may eventually become some of its most effective advocates. The sister who mocked my degree learned that her boss was my former intern. But the real story is that we both learned how to build careers that honor our individual strengths while supporting each other's continued growth and success. And now, when we attend family gatherings, the conversation about our careers is very different. Instead of arguments about practical choices versus impractical dreams, we have discussions about how different types of expertise can complement each other, how professional success can take many forms, and how families can learn to celebrate diverse definitions of achievement. Jessica still occasionally jokes about how wrong she was during our early career discussions, but she also regularly refers potential clients to me when they need expertise in contemporary art curation, and I regularly recommend her services to colleagues who need innovative financial planning for cultural institutions. The mockery has been replaced by mutual respect, professional collaboration, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building careers that are both personally meaningful and professionally successful. Most importantly, we've become living proof that families can evolve beyond their initial judgments and assumptions, and that the career choices that seem most questionable to others may eventually prove to be the most insightful and valuable. The sister who mocked my degree now works in the industry she once dismissed, and she's more successful than she ever was in the field she thought was more practical. The irony is complete, but the result is a stronger relationship and two more fulfilling careers than either of us could have built alone. 10 years after that transformative Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself standing in the newly constructed wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, watching the final preparations for what would become known as the most ambitious cultural exhibition in recent history. The Future Heritage Exhibition was a collaboration between 15 major museums across 3 continents, showcasing how contemporary digital art would be preserved and experienced by future generations. What made the exhibition particularly meaningful to me was that it represented the culmination of everything Jessica and I had learned about combining cultural vision with financial innovation. Her company, Rodriguez Financial Consulting, had developed the funding model that made the international collaboration possible, while my curatorial expertise had shaped the artistic vision. "Emma, the Times reporter is here for the final interview," my assistant announced, interrupting my contemplation of a massive interactive installation that responded to viewers' movements with cascading patterns of light and sound. The interview was scheduled to be the capstone piece for the exhibition's media coverage, but I knew the reporter would also be interested in the financial innovation story that had made such an ambitious international collaboration possible. "Dr. Rodriguez," said the reporter, a young woman named Sarah Kim who had been covering cultural institutions for the past several years. "This exhibition represents something unprecedented in museum history. Can you walk me through how such a massive international collaboration came together?" I gestured toward the gallery spaces around us, where teams from museums in New York, London, Tokyo, Berlin, and Sao Paulo were making final adjustments to installations that had been designed specifically for this collaborative format. "The exhibition exists because we developed new models for sharing both artistic and financial resources across institutions," I explained. "Traditional museum collaborations usually involve borrowing pieces from each other. This exhibition involved creating new works that exist simultaneously in multiple institutions, with shared ownership and shared revenue streams. And the financial structure that makes this possible was developed by your sister's firm. Jessica's team created the legal and financial framework that allows 15 different institutions to co-own digital artworks, share exhibition revenues, and collaborate on educational programming across international boundaries." What I didn't mention in the interview was that the exhibition had also become a testing ground for the next evolution of Jessica's business. She was no longer just consulting for individual museums. She was designing financial instruments that enabled entirely new forms of cultural collaboration. After the interview, I walked through the galleries one more time before the opening, appreciating the scope of what we had accomplished. The exhibition featured works by artists from 6 continents, each piece designed to explore how digital art could be preserved and experienced across different cultural contexts. In the central gallery, a massive collaborative piece called Temporal Echoes allowed visitors in all 15 participating museums to contribute to a continuously evolving digital landscape. When someone interacted with the installation in New York, their actions influenced the experience for visitors in Tokyo, London, and Sao Paulo in real time. Impressive, isn't it? I turned to find David Chen approaching, now carrying the title of Senior Vice President for Cultural Initiatives at Harrington Industries. Over the years, his role had evolved from managing partnerships with individual institutions to designing corporate strategies for supporting entire cultural ecosystems. "It's everything we hoped it would be," I replied, "and more than I thought was possible when we first started planning." "Jessica should be here soon," David said, checking his watch. "She's flying in from the London opening. The Tate's version launched yesterday to incredible reviews." The fact that we could open the same exhibition simultaneously in multiple cities, with each location offering a unique but connected experience, represented a fundamental shift in how major cultural exhibitions could be conceived and executed. "How are the other locations handling the technical integration?" I asked. "Flawlessly, from what I've heard. The real-time collaboration features are working exactly as designed. Tokyo reported that their morning rush of visitors created beautiful patterns that the Berlin team incorporated into their afternoon programming. As we talked, I noticed Jessica entering the gallery, looking slightly jet-lagged but excited. She had spent the past week traveling between the various opening locations, troubleshooting last-minute financial and legal details. "The London opening was incredible," she said, joining our conversation. "The collaborative revenue-sharing model worked perfectly. Each institution is seeing visitor numbers that exceed their projections, and the shared ticketing system is generating additional revenue that none of them could have achieved independently." David smiled. "And the corporate partnerships?" "Better than expected. Harrington's investment in the technical infrastructure is being matched by sponsors in each location. We're actually generating enough revenue to fund a second collaborative exhibition next year." As the evening progressed and the opening reception got underway, I watched visitors from around the world experience art in ways that had never been possible before. The exhibition was simultaneously global and local, allowing people to engage with contemporary art while participating in real-time cultural exchange across continents. But perhaps more significantly, the exhibition represented proof that the financial and cultural innovations Jessica and I had been developing over the past decade could scale to truly international levels. "Dr. Rodriguez," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the Detroit Museum director who had become one of Jessica's first clients years earlier, "I wanted to thank you both for including us in this collaboration. Our participation has elevated our international profile in ways we never could have achieved alone." "That was always the goal," Jessica replied, "creating opportunities for smaller institutions to participate in major international initiatives." Dr. Williams gestured toward a group of her board members who were engaged in animated conversation with colleagues from the other participating museums. "The networking opportunities alone have been invaluable. We're already discussing collaborations with institutions we never would have connected with otherwise." As the reception continued, I found myself reflecting on how far our professional partnership had evolved. The exhibition represented not just a successful collaboration between Jessica and me, but a model for how cultural institutions could work together across traditional boundaries. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the gallery lights had been dimmed, Jessica and I sat in my office with a bottle of champagne, reviewing the day's visitor numbers and press coverage. "The BBC called it a new paradigm for international cultural collaboration," Jessica said, reading from her tablet. "The Financial Times focused on the innovative funding model, and the Art Forum Review called it the most important exhibition of digital art in museum history." "Not bad for a project that started with your company trying to solve cash flow problems for mid-sized museums," I replied. Jessica laughed. "It's funny how problems that seem small at first can lead to solutions that change entire industries." "Speaking of changing industries," I said, "what's next for RFC? This exhibition has probably generated enough attention to keep you busy for years." "Actually, I've been thinking about that. The success of this collaboration has attracted attention from other sectors. I've been approached by performing arts organizations, libraries, even some historical societies that want to explore similar collaborative models." "Are you interested in expanding beyond museums?" "I think so. The financial principles are the same. Finding ways to pool resources and share risks so that cultural institutions can be more ambitious than they could be alone." She paused, looking around my office with its view of Central Park and its walls lined with exhibition catalogs from around the world. "But I've also been thinking about succession planning, both for my company and for this," she gestured toward the museum around us. It was a conversation we had been avoiding but which had become increasingly relevant as our careers had reached new levels of success and responsibility. "What kind of succession planning?" "Well, I'm 42, you're 39. We've both achieved more than we ever expected, and we've created models that other people can build on. The question is whether we want to spend the next phase of our careers scaling what we've already built, or developing the next generation of leaders who can take these ideas even further." It was a thoughtful question, and one that reflected how much Jessica's thinking had evolved since her early focus on individual career advancement. "Have you thought about what that might look like?" "A few ideas. I've been approached about creating an executive education program for cultural institution leaders, basically teaching other people the financial and strategic thinking that we've developed over the past decade. And for me? You could probably run any major museum in the world at this point, but you could also help train the next generation of curators and cultural leaders. The conversation continued late into the night, as we discussed possibilities that ranged from academic appointments to consulting roles to entirely new ventures that would combine our expertise in different ways. 6 months later, I found myself standing in a lecture hall at Harvard Business School, preparing to deliver the opening session of the first Cultural Leadership Initiative, a joint program between Harvard, Columbia, and the Smithsonian Institution. The program had been designed to train senior leaders for cultural institutions, combining advanced business education with deep cultural sector expertise. Jessica served as the program's director, while I led the curriculum development for the curatorial and artistic components. "Good morning," I said to the cohort of 30 executives from museums, performing arts organizations, and cultural foundations around the world. Over the next 6 months, we're going to explore how cultural institutions can achieve their missions more effectively by combining artistic vision with strategic thinking and financial innovation. The program represented a natural evolution of the work Jessica and I had been doing individually. Instead of consulting with institutions one at a time, we were training leaders who could return to their organizations with new capabilities and perspectives. Among the participants was Maria Santos, the former hotel housekeeper who had been one of my first business students at the community college. She was now the executive director of a social enterprise that had grown from her original idea about redistributing hotel waste into a comprehensive program serving homeless populations across 3 states. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said during a break between sessions, "I wanted to thank you for encouraging me to think bigger about what was possible. That first business plan I presented in your class has evolved into something I never could have imagined. You did the work, Maria. I just helped you see that your ideas had potential. But that encouragement made all the difference. And now I'm here learning advanced organizational management, so I can scale our impact even further." Watching Maria and the other program participants engage with complex problems in cultural leadership, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond individual career achievement. We were multiplying our impact by developing other people's capabilities. The program's success led to requests for similar initiatives in other regions. Within 2 years, we had developed partnerships with institutions in Europe, Asia, and Latin America, creating a global network of cultural leaders who shared common frameworks for strategic thinking and collaborative problem solving. "What we've created," Jessica observed during one of our planning meetings, "is essentially a professional development ecosystem for the cultural sector. And it's generating enough revenue to be self-sustaining," added Dr. Sarah Chen, who had joined our team as Director of International Programs after completing her own transition from museum board member to cultural education entrepreneur. The financial sustainability was important, but what excited me more was the network effects we were seeing. Graduates from different cohorts were initiating collaborations with each other, creating new forms of international cultural exchange and resource sharing. "We're not just training individual leaders," I realized during one conversation with program alumni. "We're building a global community of people who think about cultural work in more strategic and collaborative ways." This community became the foundation for our next major initiative. 3 years after launching the Cultural Leadership Initiative, Jessica and I were approached by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, about developing a comprehensive framework for cultural institution development in emerging economies. The project would involve working with governments and NGOs to establish sustainable cultural infrastructure in regions where traditional Western models of museum and arts organization development had been unsuccessful. "This is our chance to apply everything we've learned at a truly global scale," Jessica said during our initial planning meetings with UNESCO representatives. "But it's also our chance to learn from different cultural contexts and adapt our approaches accordingly," I added. "The financial and organizational models that work in North American and European museums may not be appropriate for institutions in other regions. The UNESCO project required us to spend significant time traveling and working in countries across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. We collaborated with local artists, cultural leaders, and government officials to develop institution-building strategies that honored local traditions while creating sustainable organizational structures. What we're discovering, Jessica reported during a video conference from Accra, Ghana, where she was working with the government on a new national cultural center, is that many of the financial innovation principles we developed for established institutions work even better in emerging contexts, where there are fewer legacy constraints. Meanwhile, I was in Bangkok, collaborating with Thai artists and curators on exhibition models that could showcase contemporary Southeast Asian art to international audiences while maintaining strong roots in local communities. The curatorial approaches we've developed for digital and interactive art translate beautifully to traditional art forms that have been marginalized by Western-centric exhibition practices, I reported during the same conference call. The UNESCO project became a 5-year commitment that fundamentally changed how we thought about our work. Instead of just innovating within existing cultural ecosystems, we were helping to create entirely new ecosystems in regions where sustainable cultural institutions had been difficult to establish. The work was challenging in ways we hadn't anticipated. We had to learn about political contexts, economic development strategies, and cultural traditions that were far removed from our experience in American museums and financial institutions. But it was also the most rewarding work either of us had ever undertaken. We're not just consulting anymore, Jessica observed during one of our rare breaks together in New York. We're participating in cultural development at a foundational level. And we're learning that the principles we thought were universal actually need to be adapted to very different contexts, I added. It's made me a better curator and a better thinker about cultural institutions. The UNESCO work also attracted attention from other international development organizations. We were invited to advise on cultural components of post-conflict reconstruction efforts, economic development initiatives that included cultural tourism components, and education programs that integrated arts and cultural education into broader curricula. You realize, David Chen said during one of our regular check-ins, that you've essentially created a new field of professional practice. What do you mean? Cultural institution development consulting. 5 years ago, that wasn't really a thing. Now there are dozens of people around the world doing variations of the work you pioneered. He was right. Our approaches had been replicated and adapted by consultants, academics, and cultural leaders throughout the world. More importantly, the people we had trained through the Cultural Leadership Initiative were implementing similar strategies in their own contexts. We've gone from being practitioners to being educators to being, what would you call it? Jessica asked. Movement builders, I suggested. We've helped create a global movement of people who think about cultural work as both mission-driven and strategically sophisticated. As we entered our 15th year of professional collaboration, Jessica and I found ourselves facing questions about legacy and long-term impact that we had never anticipated when our partnership began with her need for my professional connections. The question, Jessica said during one of our strategic planning sessions, is whether we want to continue expanding our direct involvement in more projects, or whether we want to focus on developing the frameworks and training programs that allow other people to do this work. Both approaches have value, I replied. Direct project work keeps us connected to real-world challenges and opportunities, but training and framework development multiplies our impact through other people's work. We decided to pursue a hybrid approach, maintaining involvement in a small number of high-impact direct projects while investing more heavily in education and framework development. This decision led to the establishment of the Rodriguez Institute for Cultural Innovation, a research and training organization affiliated with Columbia University. The institute would serve as a hub for developing new approaches to cultural institution management, training leaders from around the world, and conducting research on the economic and social impact of cultural institutions. What I love about this next phase, Jessica said during the Institute's opening ceremony, is that it represents everything we've learned about combining individual expertise with collaborative impact. The Institute's first major research project was a comprehensive study of the economic impact of cultural institutions in mid-sized cities around the world. The research would provide data to support policy arguments for cultural investment while identifying best practices for sustainable cultural development. The goal, I explained to the research team, is to move beyond anecdotal evidence and provide rigorous data about how cultural institutions contribute to economic development, community building, and quality of life. The research project attracted funding from foundations, governments, and corporations interested in understanding the return on investment for cultural sector support. More importantly, it provided a framework for cultural leaders to make data-driven arguments for their work. This is the kind of research that would have made my early career much easier, Jessica reflected during one team meeting. I was making intuitive arguments about the economic value of cultural institutions, but I didn't have comprehensive data to support those arguments. The Institute's research findings were published in a series of reports that became standard references for cultural policy discussions around the world. The data showed that cultural institutions generated economic returns that far exceeded their operating costs, while also providing social benefits that were difficult to quantify but clearly valuable to communities. More importantly, the research identified specific strategies that cultural institutions could use to maximize their economic and social impact while maintaining their artistic and educational missions. What we've proven, I said during a presentation of the research findings to a UNESCO conference in Paris, is that the choice between cultural mission and economic sustainability is a false dilemma. The most effective cultural institutions are those that pursue both goals simultaneously. The success of the Institute's research program led to requests for similar studies in specific regions and cultural contexts. We developed partnerships with universities and research organizations around the world, creating a global network of scholars and practitioners working on cultural institution development. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of our work at the Institute was the growing community of cultural leaders who had been trained in our programs and were now implementing innovative approaches in their own contexts. We're seeing the emergence of a global generation of cultural leaders who think differently about their work, Jessica observed during the Institute's 5th anniversary celebration. They're more strategic, more collaborative, and more confident about advocating for the value of cultural institutions, I added. The anniversary celebration brought together alumni from our various programs, representing cultural institutions from 6 continents. The conversations throughout the evening revealed the extent to which our approaches had been adapted and implemented, in contexts we had never anticipated. Dr. Rodriguez, said Chen Wei, who had participated in our program 5 years earlier and was now the director of a major cultural center in Shanghai, I wanted to share that we've implemented your collaborative exhibition model with institutions across Asia. Our next exhibition will include participants from 12 countries. And we've used Ms. Rodriguez's financial frameworks to establish the first intercity cultural institution investment fund in China, added Dr. Liu Ming, Chen Wei's colleague. It's allowing smaller cities to participate in major cultural initiatives that were previously only available to Beijing and Shanghai. Similar conversations revealed that our approaches had been adapted for contexts ranging from rural community centers in Kenya to major museum complexes in Sao Paulo. The financial and organizational principles we had developed were proving to be flexible enough for very different cultural and economic contexts. What strikes me, said Maria Santos, who had become one of our most effective program facilitators, is that all of these adaptations maintain the core insight that cultural work can be both mission-driven and strategically sophisticated. As the evening progressed, Jessica and I found ourselves reflecting on the trajectory that had brought us to this point. 15 years ago, she said, I thought success meant climbing the corporate ladder and maximizing individual achievement. And I thought success meant pursuing my passion regardless of practical considerations, I replied. Now I think success means creating frameworks that allow other people to achieve more than they could have alone. And doing work that contributes to something larger than ourselves. The conversation was interrupted by David Chen, who had been a constant presence throughout our professional evolution. I've been thinking about your story, he said, and what strikes me is how completely your definition of success has evolved. How so? When I was your intern, Emma, you were focused on building your individual reputation as a curator. Jessica, you were focused on building your individual business. Now you're both focused on building capacity for other people to succeed. That's what happens when you realize that individual achievement is limited by individual capabilities, Jessica replied. But collaborative achievement is limited only by your ability to develop other people's capabilities. As the anniversary celebration wound down, Jessica and I found ourselves in the Institute's library, surrounded by books and reports documenting the global impact of cultural institution development work. "You know what I'm most proud of?" Jessica said, looking around the room. "What?" "Not the individual success we've achieved, but the fact that our success has created opportunities for so many other people to succeed." "I'm proud of that too, and I'm proud that we've proven that sibling rivalry can evolve into sibling collaboration, even when it starts with one sister mocking the other's career choices." We laughed, thinking about how far we had come from that first Thanksgiving dinner confrontation. "The funny thing," I said, "is that everything we've built started because you needed my professional connections for a business meeting. And because I was finally forced to admit that I didn't understand your field as well as I thought I did. But the real transformation happened when we learned to combine our different types of expertise instead of competing with each other." As we prepared to leave the Institute that evening, Jessica paused at the door and looked back at the space we had created. "This represents everything we've learned about turning conflict into collaboration and individual achievement into collective impact. And it represents everything we've learned about the importance of being wrong about something important." "What do you mean?" "If you hadn't been wrong about my career, you never would have discovered your own career in cultural finance. If I hadn't been wrong about the importance of strategic thinking, I never would have learned to combine curatorial work with institutional development. So our mistakes turned out to be our greatest assets. Our willingness to admit our mistakes and learn from them turned out to be our greatest assets." As we walked out of the Institute together, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us to this point. The sister who had once mocked my degree had become my most important professional collaborator. The career that had seemed impractical to my family had become the foundation for work that was improving cultural institutions around the world. Most importantly, we had learned that success is not a finite resource that siblings need to compete for, but an expandable resource that grows when it's shared. The woman who mocked my degree eventually discovered that her boss was my former intern. But the real story is that we both discovered our greatest professional potential lay not in competing with each other, but in combining our strengths to create opportunities for other people to succeed. Years later, when people ask us about the evolution of our professional relationship, we tell them that the best partnerships often emerge from the most unlikely beginnings. The sister who dismissed my career ended up building her own career in the field she had mocked. The curator who focused solely on artistic vision learned to appreciate the importance of financial innovation and strategic thinking. And the intern who once brought us coffee became the bridge that helped us understand how different types of expertise could complement each other instead of competing. Today, the Rodriguez Institute for Cultural Innovation continues to train leaders, conduct research, and develop new models for cultural institution success. Our programs have graduated over 2,000 cultural leaders from more than 50 countries. Our research has influenced policy decisions that have resulted in billions of dollars of new investment in cultural infrastructure worldwide. But perhaps most importantly, we've proven that families can evolve beyond their initial judgments and assumptions, and that the career choices that seem most impractical to others may eventually prove to be the most insightful and transformative. The sister who mocked my degree learned that her boss was my former intern. But the deeper truth is that we both learned how to transform competition into collaboration, individual ambition into collective impact, and family conflict into professional partnership. And now, when young people tell us about family members who don't understand their career choices, we share our story as proof that sometimes the people who doubt you most can become your strongest advocates, and that the most fulfilling success often comes from helping other people achieve their own versions of meaningful professional accomplishment. The mockery has been replaced by mutual respect, sibling rivalry has evolved into collaborative leadership, and two individual careers have become a shared legacy of helping other people build cultural institutions that serve their communities while achieving financial sustainability. Most importantly, we've demonstrated that admitting you were wrong about something important can be the beginning of the most rewarding phase of your professional life. 20 years after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I stood once again in a family gathering, but this time the setting was quite different. We were celebrating the opening of the Rodriguez Institute's newest international campus in Sao Paulo, and 3 generations of our family had gathered to mark the occasion. Jessica was giving a toast, her voice carrying the same confidence it had always held, but now directed toward celebrating collective achievement rather than individual superiority. "To my sister Emma," she said, raising her glass to the assembled crowd of family, colleagues, and institute alumni, who taught me that the most practical career choice is often the one that looks least practical from the outside. The laughter that filled the room was warm and appreciative, completely different from the dismissive chuckles that had greeted my career aspirations 2 decades earlier. And to everyone here who chose to follow their passion despite skeptics, even when those skeptics were family members who should have known better, Jessica continued, with a self-deprecating smile that acknowledged her own journey from critic to champion. As the evening wound down, Jessica and I found ourselves on the terrace overlooking the city, much as we had stood in my office years earlier when she first learned about David Chen's role as her client's boss. "You know what's funny?" she said, looking out at the lights of Sao Paulo. "I spent so many years thinking I was the practical one, when really I was just the one with the narrower imagination." "We both learned and grew," I replied. "That's what matters. But you were right from the beginning about following your passion and building something meaningful. And you were right about the importance of financial sustainability and strategic thinking. We just needed to learn that both perspectives were valuable." Jessica smiled and pulled out her phone, showing me a text message from David Chen, who was now CEO of his own cultural investment firm. He sent this earlier today. 20 years later, I'm still using the project management skills Dr. Rodriguez taught me during my internship. Best professional education I ever received. That internship changed all our lives, I observed. The best parts of our success came from admitting what we didn't know and learning from each other. As we prepared to leave the celebration, Jessica paused and looked back at the gathering of cultural leaders, family members, and institute graduates who were still engaged in animated conversations about their work around the world. "This is what success actually looks like," she said. "Not individual achievement, but creating something that helps other people achieve more than they thought possible. And proving that the career choices that seem impractical to others can turn out to be the most important ones of all." We walked to our cars together, sisters who had transformed rivalry into partnership, skepticism into support, and individual ambition into shared legacy. The woman who once mocked my degree had learned that her boss was my former intern. But more importantly, we had both learned that the greatest success comes not from being right about everything, but from being willing to be wrong about something important, and growing from that experience. The mockery had stopped long ago. In its place, we had built something far more valuable, a relationship based on mutual respect, a shared commitment to helping others succeed, and the deep satisfaction that comes from using your professional capabilities to make the world a little bit better. And somewhere in New York, David Chen was probably working late in his office, still using the organizational frameworks he had learned as an intern, still serving as a bridge between the financial and cultural worlds that Jessica and I had learned to navigate together. The sister who mocked my degree became my greatest professional collaborator. The career that seemed impractical became the foundation for meaningful work that spanned continents. And the family dinner that started with dismissive laughter became the beginning of a partnership that would help thousands of other people build fulfilling careers in fields their own families might not have understood. Sometimes the best revenge against those who underestimate you is simply living well enough that they eventually ask for your advice. But sometimes, if you're very fortunate, it's helping them discover that they were wrong about you not because they were bad people, but because they were operating with incomplete information. And then, if you're exceptionally fortunate, you get to spend the rest of your career working alongside them to prove that success is not a zero-sum game, and that the most rewarding professional achievements are the ones that create opportunities for other people to exceed their own expectations. The sister who mocked my degree learned that her boss was my former intern. But the real ending to our story is that we both learned how to turn individual success into collective impact, family conflict into professional partnership, and career skepticism into mutual advocacy. And now, when we tell our story, the laughter comes not from mockery but from the joy of sharing how wrong assumptions can become the foundation for the most meaningful work of your life. The end.